Family, welcome back to another episode of Financial Freedom. I am your host and accompaniment on this journey, Derek Brown. Look, I have to say thank you, like I always do. We started in March 19th, 2020 to inform and inspire. And since then, y'all have not let us down. We went from one show to 35 shows, from a few views to over 45 million views. So without you, we wouldn't even be here. So I have to say thank you. I have to say thank you. You can find us on Roku. You can find us on Instagram. You can find us on Twitter. You can find us on Facebook. You can find us all under one handle at The Hope TV. One word, all caps. At The Hope TV. One word, all caps. We have a great show for you today. We have a lady coming back with us, Sylvia Neely David, MBA. She's been with us before. But for this Women's History Month, I had to bring back an expert to talk to for the subject. She has been an entrepreneur, she's a management consultant. She's a mentor. She's an advisor. She's a leadership coach. She's a national speaker. She has her bachelor's from Albany State, and she has an executive master's degree in business administration from the University of Georgia. She is 25 years deep in this HR game, plus some. She's a true generalist. She's literally been all over the HR department and knows how to run it. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Sylvia Neely David back again for the show.
Thank you, Derek. Thank you for having me again.
It's always a pleasure to have you. I'm excited about the conversation. Um, Let me ask this, because the topic of the show is really financial inequality, right? And you have the people who hear that, and it's Women's History Month and so on and so forth, and they'll say, well, why are we talking about this? I mean, clearly this isn't an issue anymore. Look at people like Serena Williams, Stacey Abrams, Michelle Obama, Beyonce Knowles, Taraji P. Henson, one of my personal favorites, Simone Biles. And then they'll say, this clearly is not an issue. Why are we discussing this? What would your response be?
Well, I would say that although we've made incredible strides over the past few decades, there is still vast inequalities between men and women as a whole. I mean, even today, women only make 82 cents to every dollar that a man makes. And even though there's been a lot of effort, especially within the last few years, toward making a difference, the inequality is still there. So it is still a challenge.
Let me ask you a question on that point, because I think that's horribly, horribly relevant in this conversation. We've seen coronavirus take the world by storm, right? We've seen people have the ability to work from home, whereas before people have been like, oh no, you can't do that from home, you can't do this from home, you can't do this. I mean, if you're pregnant, clearly you're going to be a liability. But we see all of these adaptations made for COVID, and a lot of these excuses are out the window. So commenting on those prevalent stereotypes and stuff you just mentioned on, as an HR person, how have you seen that 82 cents on the dollar justified?
Well, a lot of times it's not justified. And unless you're in a company who has an active human resources department who's taken a conscious look at things like opportunities, um, visibility for both men and women, women of color in every range. Unless you have an HR that's well versed at looking at those kinds of equal opportunities, it can get missed. And so part of what I've tried to do as a chief HR officer is make sure that we have the right programs in place that view people, that there's no particular view that any gender, race, or any other component is more important than the other. And when it relates to things like pay, if you have a compensation program in place where positions are they are titled appropriately, they are benchmarked against the market, and you have the appropriate market analysis that's happening on a reoccurring basis about every 3 years. You have an internal compensation program that's rewarding people based on factors like your work experience, your education, whether it's directly related experience or indirect experience, but is fair across the board, then
Right.
you're less likely to have these glaring inequalities around pay. And
Wow.
more and more companies are are doing that. You're hearing it every day where more companies are coming forward and saying, we're going to have the right program in place. We're going to pay people based on these factors, and these factors do not take into consideration race, gender, sexual orientation, or any of these other areas where you can be biased.
Okay. That's that's amazing, and I would love that. I would love that. Here's the thing: there are sometimes even as a male, I haven't heard of some of those programs. So I'm wondering how prevalent they are. But I'm really wondering if a woman is coming into this space and she feels as though she's hit a glass ceiling, how does she advocate
Hmm.
for herself? How does she move into HR and say, look, I don't know if you have these programs in place. I don't know if you can get these programs in place. How does a woman advocate for herself to be able to get those metrics in place to be able to make the appropriate amount that she should make? And then I also am curious about, this is my, I don't know which order you want to answer this question in, but you mentioned title. How important is your title in getting the appropriate pay that you deserve?
Well, it's a couple of things. I'll take the last question first. The titling has to do with the actual role that you're playing. So when we go out and benchmark jobs, yes, we use the title, but we also look very deeply at the job description because it tells us pretty much the depth and breadth of that role. And so it's not just the title. And when there's recommendations for title changes, we make that known to the employer. And as a
Mm,
consultant, we come in and we say, you know, that particular role, based on how it's written, is is appropriately matched to this role in the market. And so the more
mm,
prevalent title is XYZ. And we share
gotcha.
that with them, and that we would recommend that you kind of mirror the market in terms of your titling or your job architect. And so we do that. But sometimes companies reward their employees with a title, and it's confusing to the employee because that employee takes that title and go out and try to do some preliminary benchmarking, and they find out that, oh, I should be paid $100,000 more than what they're
Right,
paying. That what
right.
that person is not doing is really looking at the scope of the role and the full depth and breadth of it, because they just may not understand those kinds of things about compensation. So
Help me
titling is
understand what
important.
is,
Also, it
I'm
is
sorry, I'm
the
sorry.
role itself.
What is benchmarking?
So benchmarking is this process of every 3 years or so, an organization probably needs to take a look at where their jobs match in the market. So
Ah,
what companies often do, call in a consulting firm and say, can you market price, if you will, our jobs? And so what we do is we define the company's market. And that market
ah,
is
okay.
defined by revenues, size of company, industry, geographic location, and we match those jobs to peer organizations to find out basically how you're stacking up. And
Ah,
we come back and we say, here's where you're similar, and here's where the gaps, and we would recommend that you make these adjustments to make sure that you are in line with your market.
okay. Gotcha. Okay. That makes a lot of sense.
So your second question about how do women advocate for themselves,
Right, right.
basically, if you feel like you don't have the appropriate job title, job grade, pay, and those kinds of things, you really have to do the research. You have to go out on your own and find out using your job description and your title, and find out what peer organizations are paying their people. And a lot of times you have to do that through informal networks. but you can
Okay.
also use online like pay.com or payscale.com and at least get in the ballpark around what you should be paid. And
Mm.
at that point, if you feel comfortable enough, I would recommend you go directly to your human resources and you talk about, based on, your market research, this is what you're finding, and what you bring to the table, and that you're asking that they close that gap for you. But in terms of pushing that forward, it's always important that you have in an organization both a mentor and an advocate. And sometimes they can be all in one, and sometimes it's more than one person. And
Yeah.
that advocate is someone who, at the C suite level, has the relationships to be able to say, Mary Smith is a hard worker, and I'm seeing her as a rising star. And I think we need to give her additional opportunities for, not just visibility, but opportunities where she can grow in this organization. And right now, she's having a challenge around her pay, and I'd like for us to take a look at it. And if that C suite person is saying that to the CEO, the chances of Mary getting an opportunity to have her salary reviewed are much greater.
Ah, okay. So once you have a mentor in that space, you have someone who can help you advocate on your behalf. So let me
Absolutely.
ask you, let me ask you this: how does one go about getting Sylvia Neely David as her mentor with all this greatness that she has? I distinctly remember hearing a conversation while I was signing on to this interview of someone who thinks you're fantabulous. So how do we grasp that mentor, right? Like if a young woman sees, and I've had this question myself, even as a young man, like, because sometimes your mentor, you may view them, you go, man, they're awesome, they're great, they've done all these wonderful things.
Mm-hmm.
I need them in my corner, but they're also like yourself, heavily sought after. How do we,
Mm-hmm.
get into that, to the midst of that mentor, to be able to say, I really need your advice, your leadership, your however we phrase it, and
Mm-hmm.
not necessarily be a burden on our mentor. Because I think we forget sometimes that our mentors have challenges. They have responsibilities and obligations
Absolutely.
too. So we don't want to be an obligation to them, and we don't want them to be a leech to us. So how do we get somebody like you and say, hey, I need you in this space. You're everything you have. I need that information. I need your expertise.
Well, I think you have to have some awareness around your community, have awareness around your area of expertise to be able to pick
Mm-hmm.
someone that
Right.
you feel like could guide you and mentor you. And I
Right.
would recommend that you be surprised. People are more than willing and even flattered to be a mentor if you approach them. And I
Yeah.
think that doesn't happen quite as much. As far as I'm
Mm-hmm.
concerned, I was sharing as you were coming on that I take on personally about about 4 to 5 um, women of color who are professional
Mm-hmm.
women, usually working in corporate America, every
Yeah.
year. And I always have to
Wow.
turn some away, and then they start to
Right.
call me, their unofficial mentor. So I have that challenge, but also part of what you heard me saying is, if stay tuned, I'd like to come back at it some other time and talk about some additions to the service offerings with our firm, where we're going to dedicate more of our services toward mentoring professional level women and men. Because we're recognizing, especially with women and men of color, that they're just not getting those opportunities internally. And it
Mm.
is just critical to their success. And so we're going to be enhancing some of our services to try to address that need.
That's good to know. That's really good to know, actually. Let me ask this. With that being said, sometimes women and men are of color are not getting the appropriate opportunity. But let's focus on the women per se. Because of our
Hmm.
topic, let's make sure we focus there. Let me ask you this: how should a woman know if she's actually being brought in because especially a woman of color, if they actually want her
Hmm.
input, her feedback, her ability, she merited her way into that spot versus she's
Hmm.
being brought on as a token. What are the symptoms
Hmm.
of being the token black woman juxtaposed to being the person who is just best for the job here?
I think you'll be able to sense that when you are in a situation where your expertise and the knowledge that you bring to the table is valued. You'll be able to feel it. They will bring you in and they will ask, like I'm often asked, Sylvia, we're trying to do XYZ. What do you think of that? What's been your experience? They will literally
Mm-hmm.
ask you that. In the opposite situation where you're just being brought there, you don't get asked. You have the position, you have the title, you
Right,
might even have some signature authority in a corner office, but you're just
right,
there. And that can be frustrating. But even
right.
when you're just there, I think it's our responsibility to go the extra mile to share our expertise, our voice, and what we bring to the table. And you might have to go, you know, kind of against the grain a little bit to get that information out. You might have to get your mentor or advocate to help you figure out how to be able to share your experience and expertise and lend it to that organization, because I think it's a great thing.
Let me ask you this, and we're winding down on time already. I want to make sure I get a couple more really good questions. And I had a friend of mine. She was up northeast in a particularly racist area. She was really struggling up there, and she found herself often frustrated. Um, when she heard her voice, when she did go against the grain, she was often looked at as if she was out of pocket. As if she was being overly aggressive. How would you suggest that a woman battles, maybe not battles, but confronts that issue while still asserting her professionalism? Because there, like you said
Hmm.
earlier, there are stereotypes and ideas in our culture that abound, especially when a woman is just trying to show a sense of leadership and take her rightful position that she was hired.
So there's a few things you have to do, Derek. And I'm going to go backwards a little bit in order to answer that
Okay.
question. As you are formulating, whether you're male or female, when you are formulating your career and you are moving up the ranks and growing yourself, it is
Right.
really important that you establish a brand.
Mm,
And that
exactly.
brand need to speak to who you are and what you are. And you also, it needs to be reflected in how you conduct yourself.
Okay.
So once you've established that brand, it doesn't happen quickly, it happens over time. Once you
Okay.
establish that brand, when you're dealing with an issue like this that's very complex and oftentimes emotional at the time because it's offensive the way you can be treated,
Right.
I think
Right.
what you do is you address the issue, you address the situation, and you're mindful of that brand that you've developed for yourself. So if your brand basically says you come off as a professional, but you do address issues, you address them directly and head on, then you act in that manner and you deal with it. And of
Mm,
course, there's always going to be people who say, well, she's just angry. Um,
right.
your
Right.
brand can withstand one or two people saying that, because there will also be a few people in the room who say, no, that's not true now. That's not fair, because I've watched Mary for 15 years and this is how
Right.
she's conducted herself. So there is
Mm,
something going on here, and I think it warrants looking at. So there's always going to be somebody in the room who can refer back to your brand and behavior over time and recognize that this is not just you being the angry person.
Right.
But there is a way that you address these issues, and you have to manage yourself. And that goes back to this emotional intelligence conversation you and I keep brushing up against
Yeah, I was just thinking
around
about
being.
that. The moment you mentioned it, I was just thinking about that conversation we had. The moment you mentioned that, yeah.
Because it's critical that you have that emotional intelligence. And if you don't have it, that you are working with someone, to get better, at it. So you have to have the emotional intelligence to be able to address an issue, stay within yourself, but make it very, very clear what's happening, and that you see it, and that you're prepared to deal with it.
So let me kind of respond back to that, because and you tell me your thoughts on this, and I got one more question, and then we'll probably wind up wrapping up after that. But I realize as a male, as a black male, right? I'm 6'3", I'm 230 pounds. I can be perceived as aggressive even when I'm not trying to be aggressive, right? So
Exactly.
I can only imagine how much more a woman may have to go through, a black woman at that, with all the stereotypes that may abound in a leadership space, especially in a male-dominated space like corporate America. So when it seems like that our level of emotional intelligence almost as higher than your average person, because we're also accounting for the perceptions that may not also be true. Like at what point are we just walking on eggshells? And how do you I mean, is that fair? How do we navigate
that? So one of the things that we have to do, and this is the work that we have to do personally with ourselves, and sometimes it takes some help externally, with whether it's mentoring, counseling, or whatever, but we have to become comfortable with ourselves. And on top of that, then we have to be self-aware. And so, yes, it requires that emotional intelligence. But when you have the emotional intelligence and you are confident in who you are, as my dad used to say, you can walk heavy. And what that means is you can be yourself and understand that, yes, there'll be consequences, but you can withstand those consequences if you know who you are and you have a really good grasp on your own self-awareness. You know how you are projecting yourself. You know that you understand the energy you're putting off. You understand your executive presence. But yes, you have to manage all those things, but you don't want to walk on eggshells. If it's putting you on eggshells, then you might have to withdraw and try to get some additional guidance. But is it stressful? Oh my goodness, Derek, it is extremely stressful, because you're being asked basically to walk through the raindrops. And that's almost an impossible task.
Really though, like that's insane. That's insane.
Yeah, it is. And what it does is it causes all these stresses and pressures on men and women, and especially women. And you see the rise in women with heart conditions, which is why all of us are wearing red and trying to bring awareness to it. But we are leaving this world over the stress and pressures of some of these kinds of conversations.
Yeah, definitely. Let me ask this, because I've heard this from some brothers who I engaged a little bit about the topic. How do men support, black males support black women, or just in general, how do men support women who want to ally with them in this space to help promote their prosperity in every area? How do we ally in that space? We just, you shut up and be quiet, or is it that we take the advocate role? How do we ally with you?
That is a wonderful question, and I know some of those allies, and I've had them in my lifetime. And fortunately for me, I'm married to one, so I think that is always helpful.
Right.
when men see these kinds of things, first of all, they have to become aware, because I think sometimes as uh, men have their own challenges, whether they're men of color or not, and so they're dealing with their own progression within the workplace, and so they really have to become aware of these issues and be able to identify them when they're happening. And that takes some time to be able to see the nuances of, discriminatory types of practices, or, unconscious bias conversations and words that can hurt a person's career and even them as a person. And once they
Right.
become aware, be that advocate to step up and say, to the coworker, that's not what she was saying, and that's not the right way to see it. Here's an example of what she's trying to say. And it will
Yeah.
be heard differently from a male, regardless of race, and
Mm.
and give some insight to where the woman actually is and what she was trying to convey. And I think that's
Okay.
really important. It is priceless to have that advocacy.
So should I as a male, right? So let's say hypothetically me and you were in a room and someone hears you say something and I know it wasn't received how you meant it. Should I wait for you to say, Derek, would you mind talking to so and so? Or should I take it upon myself to go, let me go speak to so and so because I know they didn't receive that right? Where,
I think it should
how
be
do
a
I make sure
natural
I'm not
progression.
overstepping my bounds?
I think it should be a natural progression for that male to go ahead after the fact and make that correction, whether
Mm.
whether she says anything at that moment or not. If she doesn't, I think before leaving the room, it would be a good idea for that male to kind of walk over and say, "I know she didn't mean it that way. Here's a way to kind of understand what she was trying to say." Knowing that
Okay.
it might be taken differently by you. I think you should immediately become that advocate, because remember, I'm asking males to be a little more self aware about those things and feel free to act upon them. And then you can circle back and say, I heard what you said, and this is what I said after you left the room to support you, because I understand the message you were trying to convey.
Got you. Got you. That's always good to know. Because I've definitely heard those men before say, I'm not exactly sure what I should and should not do. I don't want to overstep my bounds. I don't want to make her feel like she needs my help, but I want to be of help. It can be a
Right.
very mixed emotional space for some guys. So
You're right. That
thank
is
you
kind
for
of
that.
delicate.
Yeah, it's weird because we don't want to be the bad guy, but we want to be on your side. And sometimes I've heard men say, "I just don't know how."
Exactly.
And then I've seen men act on the snap and make things worse than what it was. So sometimes I've been like, "Yo, just talk to her first." But at the same
Right.
time, I think what you said was very critical in the idea that
Mhm.
it should be a natural evolution of that
Hmm.
awareness to the point where we know kind of what's going on to be able to say, yeah, this is what you meant. This is not what you meant. And I know she's okay with me saying these certain things. So thank you so much for that. That's very helpful.
You are quite welcome.
Thank you. Miss Sylvia Neely David, where can we find you and your consulting ad if we need?
Well, I can be found on LinkedIn at Sylvia Neely David, linkedin.com, and then Sylvia Neely David. On Twitter, I'm at Sylvia Neely1. And then, of course, the organization is HTC Advisors, which can be found at www.htcadvisors.com.
Got you. Again, thank you so much for being here. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for coming back. We know time is valuable, so thank you.
Thank you. It's been another great conversation, Derek. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, this is another episode of Financial Freedom. Thank you for taking the time to join us, and I look forward to seeing you again. As always, be safe out there.